So, Christian apologist Dr. William Lane Craig was recently interviewed by Alex O'Connor, where he tried to justify the genocide of the Canaanites by the Israelites as described in the Old Testament, mainly through two arguments. One, the divine command theory of morality, and then two, just trying to say that the Canaanites were all universally so evil, reviled, and sinful that you can't even really think about this as a genocide, even though the Israelites were moving in, taking the land of the Canaanites, and killing any Canaanites who refused to go along with the program. No, you can't even really consider that a genocide because the Canaanites were so evil and sinful that it's more of a divine punishment. It's capital punishment. God is just punishing these people for being universally sinful, and there's not a single good or innocent Canaanite in the entire land. That's basically his argument. And during it, Craig made the what I found to be very bizarre claim that I'll show here, where he basically says that a buddy of his has found some Canaanite texts that allegedly describe these evil, heinous acts of debauchery, from bestiality to child sacrifice. So let's listen to what Craig says and then ask, is this true? Like, at all?
This is not simply biblically attested. I have a colleague, Professor Clay Jones, who has done a study of ancient literature coming out of pre-Israelite Canaan. And it is horrific, the culture that is described there. This was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple prostitution in the worship of God. They practice bestiality. There are texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame, and then women would mount the buck and copulate with it. They were engaged in offering child sacrifice to their gods. And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them, though the biblical description doesn't go into that kind of morbid detail that these documents do.
So there you have it. Craig's colleague, Clay Jones, has allegedly done some sort of academic work where he's found these Canaanite texts. Well, let's analyze that a little bit deeper. Clay Jones has a website where he posts different blog posts, which is what Craig is referring to here, not any sort of academic historical work on these ancient texts. No, just blog posts from a guy that has a degree in Christian apologetics and theology. The Canaanite texts that Clay Jones is citing are basically from Ugarit, which is very far in the northern Levant. It didn't really have anything to do with the Israelite conquests of Canaan. It was too far north, and it was, wiped out in the Bronze Age collapse. So the timeline doesn't exactly line up for it. The Israelites never really got that far north in that time period to interact with the Ugarites. But okay, sure. The Ugaritic religion was pretty similar to the Canaanite religion. They worshipped chiefly the Canaanite god Baal and El and Yam and Mot. The main Canaanite pantheon that we're familiar with further down south. So you could say that maybe they had some certain similar practices. Okay, so we go and we look at Clay Jones' article that he wrote about whether the Canaanites practiced bestiality, and curiously absent from that is whatever William Lane Craig was talking about with the stag and the woman riding it. Very graphic image, by the way, Craig, but yeah, that's completely gone in Clay Jones' account here. I mean, I don't know where Craig picked that up, but it wasn't from Clay Jones. Clay Jones talks about the Baal cycle, which is an epic Ugaritic poem which describes Baal fighting Yam, this sort of sea god, and Mot was the god of the underworld and death, kind of like Hades. Baal is a little bit like Zeus. It's actually interesting. that the Greeks actually borrowed a lot of some of their ideas of the gods from the Phoenicians, who shared a similar religious framework as the Canaanites. So this idea of a chief king among the gods who was a storm deity like Zeus, that was what the Phoenicians were following with Baal, which we see in the Ugaritic Baal cycle text. This is a cycle which Baal kind of fights these guys and ultimately emerges, gaining the favor of El, the chief deity among the Canaanites, who is a little bit like Yahweh from the Abrahamic gods. You'll see I have a video on that, my first ever video on the evolution of the Abrahamic god. Check that out if you want more details on that. But the Greeks borrowed a lot of this from the Phoenicians, so we know a little bit of the dynamics there. And Clay Jones states that in the Baal cycle, Baal is depicted as having intercourse with some cattle, like a lot of times. And he's saying that, well, look, if there's a people group who have one of their chief deities making love to animals, then surely that would mean that bestiality was just accepted and was a cultural practice. So, yeah, that is not at all what William Lane Craig was claiming the argument was. I mean, you could literally make the same argument for the Greeks. Zeus getting it on with animals, or assuming the form of an animal and getting it on with people. I mean, that's all over Greek mythology. So I don't think that argument is particularly strong. It doesn't really hold water, and it's not at all what William Lane Craig claimed was Clay Jones's argument. In fact, it appears that the instance that William Lane Craig was talking about with the stag and the women riding it was from a Sumerian text. So just a completely different civilization with a completely different religion, totally different set of gods and pantheons. So, wow, I don't know if that was just some sort of brain cross wiring that William Lane Craig just went through and he just forgot that he was talking about the Sumerians and not the Canaanites. But, I mean, come on, that's just blatant misinformation that just spewed right out of his mouth and went uncorrected for the record. So, William Lane Craig's comments about bestiality were completely unfounded, essentially, and have been totally debunked just from a cursory look at his sources. So, what about his second claim, then, about child sacrifice? Well, this gets a little bit more interesting in the historical context. Now, I've done debates on the Exodus before and whether or not it's happened, and needless to say, if the Exodus did happen or something like it, it was on a much, much smaller scale with maybe a Egyptian kind of religious leader leading some Semites out of Egypt into the lands of the Israelites. But the Israelites were never in Egypt, right? Israel, the Israelite culture developed out of the Canaanite culture. There are just so many cultural similarities and a smooth archaeological transition from all Canaanite cultures in the area to Israelite culture developing gradually as it buds out of that. And they begin to define themselves as a culture in opposition to the surrounding Canaanites. And we see this kind of phenomenon happen all the time in studies of anthropology, where when two cultures are right next to each other, and they want to differentiate each other, they tend to define themselves in opposition to each other, and they tend to become more polarized and more extremely opposed. So that's very likely what was going on with the early Israelites as they sort of split apart from the surrounding Canaanites. And this could very well be where all of these, highly rhetorical, highly propagandized accounts come from, describing the Canaanites as this deeply evil, repugnant people that just kill children and have sex with animals and are just all around just 100% evil dudes, because, hey, that helps you justify what you're doing to them by dispossessing them of their land and killing them, not only just killing their soldiers, but the accounts in the Old Testament are killing the women, killing the children, even killing the animals themselves. Now, William Lane Craig claims that there are Canaanite texts which describe this human sacrifice and child sacrifice and back up the biblical account. But that is simply untrue. That's just a lie. That's more misinformation. There's nothing in the Ugaritic texts that talks about child sacrifice. There's nothing in any other Canaanite texts which describe any child sacrifice. There's lots of ritual practices that are outlined, but none of them involve child sacrifice. So now it is an accusation that the Israelites make against the Canaanites, but we don't see any other non-biblical textual evidence to back that up, or any archaeological evidence that backs that up, which also seems pretty interesting when you consider that there are other cultures that have been accused of child sacrifice, where the archaeological evidence actually has backed that up, namely the Carthaginians. The Romans and the Greeks both described their Mediterranean rivals in Carthage as having partaken in child sacrifice. And we actually see the evidence of this in the archaeological record there, where we see the ashen remains of that are labeled as infants, and we see literal descriptions from their parents kind of explaining their sacrifice and what the gods did in return for them. And it's not like these are just children grave sites. I mean, because it's children and also lambs. You don't really bury a bunch of children with a bunch of lambs unless they're all sacrifices to the gods. So the actual evidence does seem to support that the Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice. But again, those are in northern Africa, not in the land of Canaan. There is, however, a really interesting connection that at least lends some plausibility to what Craig is saying here about the Canaanites participating in child sacrifice. And that is namely the fact that the Carthaginians are Phoenicians that settled outside of Phoenicia, and the Phoenicians are coastal Canaanites. So culturally, the Carthaginians are at least related in the same kind of umbrella as the Canaanites were. So if they were worshiping similar gods like Baal, if they were worshiping a similar pantheon, maybe had some similar rituals. Now, obviously, they're not going to be identical. These are pretty separate in both time and space. But at least you can see the argument that if the Carthaginians were practicing child sacrifice, maybe it's not such a stretch that the Canaanites were. However, it should be stipulated here that what William Lane Craig says about the Canaanite texts actually describing this is total misinformation hokum. On the topic, though, of child sacrifice, there's some passages in the Bible that have been misinterpreted by many people. I hear people bring up the Canaanite god Moloch, and that idea has been thrown by the wayside by academic scholarship for almost 100 years now, where it turns out that there was no Canaanite god named Moloch. Moloch is just a Hebrew word describing child sacrifice. It's like, when you offer a child in Moloch, that's the description of the action of doing a child sacrifice. It doesn't actually stipulate to which god that child is being sacrificed to. So you don't sacrifice a child to Moloch. You perform Moloch on a child in sacrifice to Baal or some sort of other god or goddess. Now that brings up a really interesting question because, maybe William Lane Craig shouldn't be throwing stones in a glass house, because there's plenty of descriptions in the Old Testament of Israelites sacrificing children. And it doesn't speculate which god they were sacrificing to. It describes Moloch, but as we know, that's not a Canaanite god. So which god were the Israelites sacrificing children to? Now, we see multiple times in the Old Testament the Israelites veering away from Yahwism, the worship of just Yahweh, but it is at least possible that these ancient Israelites were sacrificing children to Yahweh, the Abrahamic God. And there is actually some textual support for this in the Bible. Not the least of which is in Exodus chapter 13, which describes the covenant that the Israelites make with their God Yahweh, in which it says pretty explicitly that you are to sanctify the firstborn of not just your firstborn, your human firstborn, but also those of cattle or sheep or whatever. And it describes very explicitly that you're supposed to sanctify them. And it says if you don't want to sanctify your lamb, you can just break its neck. So it's like a specific kind of ritual killing sacrifice. And it says in Exodus 13, not just for cattle and sheep and goats, the firstborn of those that should you sacrifice to the Abrahamic God Yahweh, but you should also sacrifice your firstborn. So it seems likely that maybe some more strictly literal interpretations of the Old Testament back in the Iron Age, the more conservative Hebrews may well have said, well, look, it says right here, I'm supposed to sacrifice my firstborn. And, we see sacrifice is a big part of the early ancient Israelite religion and the worship of Yahweh as the one Abrahamic God. We see sacrifices of animals to him all the time. And the entire idea of a sacrifice is that the more precious of a thing that you're sacrificing, that the more deeply powerful that sacrifice is, the more that God will hear that sacrifice. So, if you sacrifice something that's maybe the most precious to you, like your firstborn child, I mean, that is a pretty deep, desperate sacrifice that maybe when times get really, really tough, bust out the sacrifice of the firstborn. And we see that in the Old Testament, not just with like stories like with the Moabites, who the king of the Moabites sacrifices his firstborn child, and it actually worked. That his city was besieged, it was about to be conquered. He sacrificed his firstborn, and then all of a sudden the tides of war completely changed and they ended up winning. So we see this in the Old Testament, and it's not unheard of to say that maybe the Israelites were also sacrificing their firstborn children. So before you start casting stones at the Canaanites, maybe make sure that your own closets are empty of skeletons there on that account. But really, William Lane Craig's chief argument here, it seems to be that the whole definition of what is morally good has to come from God, or at least comes from God in his worldview. And thus, if God commands it, it must be morally good. So even if God commands a genocide, then it becomes a morally good genocide because in light of the fact that God commanded it. That's the divine command theory of morality. So I'm really not sure why, if William Lane Craig adheres to divine command theory, that he even would feel the need to bring up all of this. Oh, well, the Canaanites were evil. They had it coming. They did bestiality and child sacrifice. And really, they just had it coming. And it was like it was morally good. It was a punishment to wipe them out because they were all evil. There were no innocents. Like, why even bother jumping through those hoops and trying to make those apologetic arguments if you just believe that God commanded it, therefore it is the right thing? If that's really what you believe, why waste all this time trying to paint the Canaanites in such an evil light that's like cartoonishly evil that nobody in their right mind would believe is an accurate depiction of history? Like, show me one society where there's not a single good person. And like saying that the children were also deserving of death because they would just grow up into those people, and like they couldn't be adopted by the Israelites. They just had to die. And William Lane Craig even goes so far as to say that murdering these Canaanite children was a blessing. He says that it was a blessing for them because they go to heaven and spend eternity with God, when otherwise they would have just grown up to be evil Canaanites.
What I would say is, first, that God has the right to take anyone's life whenever he wants to. Unfortunately, children die all the time in infancy. And so if God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, prematurely, that's his prerogative. But then secondly, on my theology, these children go immediately to heaven. They go to be with God, and therefore come to know a life that is more glorious and more happy than anything conceivable, and certainly far better than if they had been allowed to live and be raised in such a corrupt and evil environment as they were in. So it was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
And like, Oh my God. Talk about like, if you are getting to the point in your religious beliefs where you are not only justifying the murder of children, but you're saying it was a blessing for them. It was a good thing to kill those children. Like, whoa, pump the brakes. Look yourself in the mirror. I mean, that is evil. Like, that is repugnant. I really think that that's like some of the most evil thing I've heard from one of these Christian apologetics is trying to justify the murder of children by saying it's actually good for them. I mean, whoa, God, man, it just like leaves a bad taste in my mouth. And you don't need a deity or a god to say that something is evil or something is good. Like, you could have other groundings of morality other than just a deity. Okay, I could point to William Lane Craig and say, dude, what he's saying right there is evil. It is gross. It is vile. I mean, the amount of dehumanization going on in William Lane Craig's mind. I mean, he even says that he had to wrestle with this for a long time, and like this, his moral intuitions were telling him that this was wrong, that this was unjustified death and killing and genocide. And he said that he wrestled with this, and now he's gone through these mental gymnastics to try to justify this to himself in this state of cognitive dissonance to say, actually, it was a good thing. These children were blessed when the Israelites murdered them and established the land of Israel. Like, oh my God, dude. He even goes so far to say that the only wrong that was done in this Israelite genocide of the Canaanites, the only wrong that was done was actually that the Israelite soldiers had to kill all these women and children and probably got PTSD from it. And he's saying that's the only wrong that was done. Like, dude, take a step back, man. What is wrong with you?
Dawkins quotes an article that you wrote in response to this issue, and I suppose I should read what the point that he pulled out, which summarizes this position here. You said, "So whom does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites?
Right.
Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. Not the children, for they inherit eternal life. So who is wronged? Ironically, I think the most difficult part of this whole debate is the apparent wrong done to the Israeli soldiers themselves.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it would be like to have to break into some house and kill a terrified woman and her children? The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. I must say that the disturbing thing to me there is I can't shake this feeling. And like I say, I have respect for you as a thinker and a philosopher, and I always enjoy our conversations. But hearing somebody talking about the slaughter of admittedly and explicitly innocent children, not to mention animals, as well as the eradication, driving out of an entire society, and to say that, well, the people who really suffered here were the soldiers who had to kill the innocent woman. It just, in a way that like I said at the very beginning of this segment, there's nothing I can do strictly speaking to prove that there's no justification for this. But if there is anything that I've ever heard in my life that jumps out of a page with pure moral repugnance in the way that it meets my ears, it has to be something like that.
Well, I've really thought hard and dispassionately about this, Alex, and I tried to think as hard as I could, who has been wronged in this action? And it's very difficult to think of anyone who has been wronged by God in commanding this. And then it hit me, well, what about the Israeli soldiers themselves? Because we do know from soldiers who suffer from PTSD that the brutalizing effects of war upon soldiers is terrible.
If Christians are really going to try to claim some sort of moral high ground, maybe you should start by not bending over backwards to try to justify literal genocide of children. Maybe that's a good place to start with being the morally superior group, right? Because I mean, I'm not going to be looking to my morality to any group that's trying to say that those Canaanite children had it coming and it was a blessing that they were murdered. And Alex O'Connor did offer some pushback on this and say, well, like, what about people that are mentally unstable and they think that God is commanding them to go kill children. I mean, are they justified? Because it's a divine commandment. They have what they think is a conversation with God. They think God is telling them to do this. How could they doubt it if God has literally done this in the Bible before? There's like literally a past track record to make you think, well, hey, I mean, God's told people to kill children before, and that was morally good. So now that God's talking to me and telling me to kill children, I should just go ahead and do it. Like, how could you possibly, like, once you go and try to justify one genocide, I mean, how can you stop right there? I mean, you've permanently said, God is willing to command people to kill children if he's done that before. So it just seems like a really gross, really repugnant type of God to be worshiping if that's the God that William Lane Craig believes and does his apologetics for. I mean, I'm sorry, man, but that's just evil. Is William Lane Craig fringe in this, or is this mainstream? I mean, I haven't heard many Christians talking about this. Maybe this is something they want to sweep under the rug and they don't really want to address that often, but like, is this what they believe just as a main tenet of Christianity? I mean, if you're a Christian and you don't agree with William Lane Craig on this, like, please let me know. Help restore my faith in humanity a little bit. And just, I would rather not think that the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews their whole religious beliefs are underpinned on this idea that their God has, at one point in history, ordered the mass genocide killings of Canaanite children. I just legitimately don't understand why Craig would even bring up these arguments trying to paint the Canaanites as being so sinful and evil that it was just to genocide them, their wives, their children, their farm animals, etc. Like, he doesn't think that about any other people in history. Like, he wouldn't say, well, the Aztecs were doing human sacrifice, so what the Spanish did to them was totally justified. You don't see Craig making that argument. I mean, there are some fascistic Christian nationalists who do make arguments like that. I've seen them trying to justify, like, the Crusades or the Conquistadors as bringing the light of Christianity to these savage peoples. But, like, generally, I don't think that that's a very common argument. Like, you wouldn't say, oh, well, the North was justified or should have genocided the American South in the Civil War because the South was just totally doing slavery and evil acts, and it was this evil society. There was no innocent person in the South, and the North should have just genocided them all because they were doing slavery. Like, you don't ever hear arguments like that, but I guess according to Christians, slavery is not a sin, which seems like a big omission to me, but okay, not the topic of this video. But still, like, nobody is trying to make these arguments that William Lane Craig is making to justify any other types of genocide. You don't say, oh, well, those people were doing debauchery, so we should just genocide their entire civilization, kill all their children, kill all their pets and their farm animals. Like, no, that's insane. But yet that's what Craig is making the argument for here about the Canaanites, even though he stipulates that his actual argument is just divine command theory and that it's actually not bad because God commands it, which, like, you can't even really argue against because he's just changing the definition of what good is to just be whatever God says to do. So, like, yeah, if you just change the definitions of words, then sure, like, anything can be good if God says it is. I mean, come on. I mean, it's just a total cop-out just to try to justify this cognitive dissonance. So, yeah, incredibly weird, off-putting, and quite revolting arguments from William Lane Craig on this one that I don't think any Christian should be picking up these arguments, should be proud of hearing these arguments in their community. Like, I mean, I found this to be quite disgusting, and hopefully all of you good Christians out there did too. So, yeah, this one is debunked. Add another one to the roster. These Christian apologetics, man, they gotta stop lying. Like, it's okay to do apologetics and defend your beliefs, but, like, maybe don't lie about it, and maybe don't try to justify the genocide of children. Like, is that too much to ask? Is that bar too high at this point? Like, come on, people. If you enjoyed this debunking video and you want to see more debates, debunks, and just overall science and history topics addressed on this channel, stay tuned for more, subscribe, and keep learning.